The air in the Northern Territories during the winter of 1884 did not just carry a chill, it carried the weight of an era where a single misstep was a signed death warrant. This was a time when the boundary between the civilized world and the primordial abyss was as thin as a layer of frost on a window pane. We begin our journey not with a hero, but with a man reduced to his most fundamental biological components: flesh, bone, and the desperate heat of circulating blood. He lies at the base of a jagged ravine, the silence of the spruce forest broken only by the rhythmic, wet sound of his own labored breathing. Silas Thorne, a veteran trapper of the Hudson's Bay Company traditions, has just felt the world shift. A simple trek across a frozen scree slope ended in a sickening crunch, the sound of a femur fracturing against granite. In the 1880s, a broken leg in the subarctic wilderness was not a medical emergency. It was a transition into a different category of existence. To the historical record, Silas was a pioneer. To the mountain, he was suddenly and irrevocably carrion. Historical records from this era show that the winter of 1884 was one of the most brutal on record, with temperatures plummeting to levels that could freeze exposed skin in under 3 minutes. For a man like Silas, the cold was a physical weight, a silent thief that began to pickpocket his body heat the moment he stopped moving. But the cold was not his only visitor. As the sun began its rapid descent toward the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow, the sensory reality of the frontier shifted. The scent of fresh, copper-rich blood began to travel on the thermal currents of the valley. The harsh reality of the 1880s meant that the hierarchy of the woods was absolute. As Silas dragged his mangled limb through the powder, leaving a dark arterial signature behind him, he looked back. There, at the edge of the tree line, where the silver firs met the grey sky, the first pair of eyes appeared. Then another, and another. 12 pairs of sulphurous, unblinking yellow lanterns ignited in the dusk. The timber wolf, Canis lupus, was not merely a predator in this context. It was a witness to his decline. These were not the romanticized creatures of modern fiction. These were starving apex predators during a black winter, a period where game was scarce and desperation was the primary driver of behavior. Silas reached for his Winchester 1873, the gun that won the West, but his fingers, numbing under the onset of stage 2 hypothermia, could barely find the lever. He realized then that he was no longer the hunter. He had been demoted. The psychological threshold he crossed in that moment is what historians often call the Great Stripping, where the ego of the human mind is peeled away by the realization that in the eyes of the wild, you are simply a caloric resource. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the mountain men. They lived by a code of self-reliance so absolute it bordered on the religious. Silas knew that no one was coming. His cabin was 4 miles away, a distance that, with a broken leg and a dozen wolves in tow, might as well have been on the moon. The wolves didn't attack immediately. They didn't need to. They were masters of surround and exhaust tactics, a biological patience developed over millennia. They watched him struggle. They smelled the infection already beginning its microscopic work in his wound. They waited for the cold to do the heavy lifting. As Silas began the agonizing crawl toward a stand of ancient cedars, his breath came in ragged plumes of white vapor. Every inch gained was paid for in a currency of pure agony. The snapping of a dry twig nearby sounded like a pistol shot in the dead air. He turned his head, his beard matted with ice and grit, and locked eyes with the alpha, a massive, scarred male whose coat was the color of a winter thunderstorm. In that gaze, there was no malice, only the cold, industrial efficiency of nature. This was the beginning of the end, the threshold where the history of a man meets the timeless hunger of the earth. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History And tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? The dragging of a human body through deep powder creates a specific sound, a rhythmic, guttural hushing that mimics the wind, yet carries the heavy cadence of mortality. For Silas Thorne, every yard gained toward the distant silhouette of his cabin was a negotiation with his own history. To understand the gravity of his situation, we must look at the forgotten customs of the 19th century frontiersmen, men who lived in a world where the tools they carried were not merely equipment, but extensions of their very will to exist. In his heavy canvas pack, Silas carried the archive of life, a small tin of salt pork, a Hudson's Bay tobacco twist, and a hand-forged skinning knife with a handle carved from elk antler. These were the mundane artifacts of a grueling era. The salt pork, cured with enough nitrates to survive a year in a damp cellar, was more than food. It was the chemical fuel his heart needed to keep pumping against the encroaching frost. The knife, however, had transitioned from a tool of trade to a weapon of last resort. Historical records from the 1880s highlight that the relationship between a trapper and his steel was nearly sacred. A dull blade was a death sentence, and a lost one was a tragedy. As the second night descended, the temperature dropped to a bone-shattering 30 degrees. In this climate, the archive of life becomes a catalogue of sensory degradation. Silas could no longer feel his toes, a phenomenon known to the pioneers as the white sleep. It is the moment when the body, in a desperate act of biological triage, pulls blood away from the extremities to protect the core. This is where the psychological weight of the past begins to bleed into the present. Between the bouts of white-hot pain from his shattered femur, Silas found his mind wandering back to the social fabric of the frontier. He remembered the warmth of the trading posts in Fort Benton, the smell of wood smoke and wet wool, and the sound of human laughter, a sound that now felt like a relic from an extinct civilization. The wolves remained. They were a constant, shifting perimeter of silver and shadow. In the 1880s, the timber wolf was viewed through a lens of pure adversarial conflict. There was no room for the modern conservationist's admiration. To Silas, they were the grey deceivers. They utilized a specific behavioral trait known as testing the threshold. They would dart in, snapping their jaws inches from his trailing leg, only to retreat when he swung his heavy rifle barrel. They were measuring him. They were calculating the exact moment when the heat of his life would flicker low enough for a safe strike. Silas reached into his coat pocket and felt a small, leather-bound ledger. This was his archive, a record of every pelt taken, every storm weathered, and the names of the men he had buried in the frozen earth over the last 20 years. It represented the burden of the pioneer, the knowledge that your entire existence could be reduced to a small book that might never be found. He realized that if he died here, his history would be consumed by the same stomachs that would digest his flesh. This realization sparked a primal, indignant spark of defiance. He began to use the tools of his trade in ways they were never intended. He used his traps, heavy steel springs designed for beaver and lynx, as anchors. He would throw a trap forward, let it bite into the frozen crust of the snow, and then haul his broken body toward it. It was a mechanical, soul-crushing process. The metallic clink of the steel against the ice was a defiant counterpoint to the low, guttural growls emanating from the darkness. The harsh reality of the 1880s meant that nature didn't care about your resume. It didn't care that Silas had survived the cholera outbreaks of the 50s or the skirmishes of the 60s. To the mountain, he was now just a collection of minerals and proteins moving slowly across a white canvas. The archive of life was closing page by agonizing page as the yellow eyes drew closer, emboldened by the scent of a man who was slowly becoming a ghost before he had even stopped breathing. By the third day, the physical pain of the shattered femur had transitioned into a dull, rhythmic throb, replaced by a much more insidious enemy, the crushing weight of absolute solitude. In the 1880s, the Great Silence of the North was not a metaphor. It was a psychological phenomenon documented by early frontier surgeons as Arctic hysteria or the cabin fever of the open. When a human being is stripped of social interaction and placed in a life or death struggle against a landscape that does not acknowledge their existence, the mind begins to fracture. Silas Thorne was now 2 miles from his cabin, 2 miles of jagged ice and predator-thick shadows. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the mountain men who often spoke to their horses, their rifles, or the wind itself to keep the internal gears of the psyche from seizing up. Silas began to hold whispered conversations with the alpha wolf. He gave the beast names: Old Ledger, the Debt Collector, the Grey Deacon. This wasn't madness. It was a desperate survival mechanism to turn a terrifying force of nature into a tangible adversary he could reason with. The psychological isolation of the frontier was exacerbated by the geographical reality of the 19th century. There were no satellites, no distress flares, no cavalry over the hill. The nearest human soul was likely 70 miles away at the McLeod trading post. This realization creates a specific kind of vertigo, the void of the self. As Silas watched the 12 pairs of yellow eyes circle him in a slow, hypnotic carousel, he felt the boundaries of his own identity blurring. Was he Silas Thorne, the respected trapper, or was he merely a fading heat signature in a world of ice? The wolves were now closer, their confidence growing as Silas's movements became more erratic. They could hear his heart rate spiking. They could see the tremors in his hands. Historical records from this era show that timber wolves are highly sensitive to vulnerability cues. They weren't just waiting for him to die, they were waiting for him to surrender. The isolation had turned the woods into a high-stakes poker game where the ante was his soul. He began to hallucinate. The flickering aurora borealis above, the aurora borealis that the Cree people called the dance of the spirits, seemed to take the shape of his mother's kitchen in Virginia. He could almost smell the sourdough and the dry heat of a wood stove. This is the lure of the cold, a dangerous stage of hypothermia where the brain, starved of oxygen and warmth, creates comforting delusions to ease the transition into death. Silas had seen men walk into the white, simply stand up, strip off their clothes, and wander into the woods because they felt too warm. He bit his lip until the metallic tang of blood snapped him back to the frozen present. The isolation was a physical pressure, like the weight of the deep ocean. He realized that the wolves were his only connection to the living world. If they left, he would truly be alone in the void. This twisted irony, finding companionship in his executioners, is a testament to the harrowing psychological landscape of the pioneers. He was a man suspended between two worlds, the civilized past he could no longer reach and the primal future that was currently licking its chops 30 feet away. The harsh reality of the 1880s meant that the mind usually broke before the body, but Silas possessed the old world grit, a psychological resilience forged in an era of manual labor and constant risk. He looked at the Alpha, who had crept to within 20 feet, its breath a foul, hot mist in the freezing air. Silas didn't scream. He didn't plead. He simply cocked the hammer of his Winchester, a metallic click that echoed through the silent forest like a heartbeat. The isolation was absolute, but as long as he could hear that click, he knew he still existed. The fourth night arrived with a tectonic shift in the atmosphere. A screaming norther began to howl through the canopy, a localized blizzard that reduced visibility to less than 5 feet. In the historical record of the American frontier, these storms were known as the White Eraser. They didn't just cover the land, they removed the landmarks of sanity. For Silas Thorne, the cabin was now less than 500 yards away, a dark smudge of cedar and hope against a wall of swirling opacities. But the smell of his exhaustion had reached a fever pitch, and the 12 pairs of yellow eyes were no longer circling. They were closing the gap. The breaking point of a human being is not a sudden snap. It is a thermal exhaustion of the soul. Silas's hands were no longer hands. They were blackened wooden talons, the skin split by the dry frost of the 1880s. He could no longer feel the trigger of his Winchester. As he attempted one final agonizing drag of his body, his shattered femur shifted, the bone fragment piercing the muscle wall. The scream that escaped him was not human. It was the sound of the prehistoric struggle for survival, and the wolves, sensing the transition from injured to dying, made their move. To understand this moment, one must look at the hunting mechanics of the grey wolf. They do not kill with a single strike like the great cats. They dismantle. The youngest of the pack, a lean yearling, lunged first, snapping at Silas's trailing boot. Silas swung the heavy rifle barrel like a club, the wood splintering against the wolf's snout. But the alpha, the scarred grey deacon, was smarter. He didn't rush. He moved with the calculated gravity of a Victorian executioner, stepping into the light of Silas's fading consciousness. The harsh reality of the 1880s meant that the final act of a pioneer was often unobserved and unrecorded. Silas was pinned. The weight of the alpha pressed down on his chest, the animal's hot carnivorous breath melting the frost on Silas's eyelashes. The sensory immersion was absolute. The smell of wet fur, the low-frequency vibration of a predatory growl, and the sound of 11 other sets of paws treading the snow in a ritualistic circle. Silas reached into his belt. He didn't grab the rifle. He grabbed his lucifer matches, primitive sulfurous friction matches that were the high-tech marvel of the era. With a dexterity born of sheer terror, he struck the bundle against the steel trap he had been dragging. A flare of brilliant chemical violet and orange erupted in the darkness. In the 19th century wilderness, fire was the only language the wild truly feared. It was the Promethean defiance. The sudden burst of light and the acrid stench of sulfur sent the pack reeling. In that 3-second window of primal confusion, Silas didn't crawl. He threw himself forward with a strength fueled by an adrenaline dump that should have stopped his heart. He reached the heavy oak door of his cabin, his fingers fumbling for the iron latch. The alpha recovered, lunging forward and sinking its teeth into Silas's shoulder, tearing through the heavy buffalo skin coat. History is decided in inches. Silas slammed his weight against the door, the wood groaning on its hand-forged hinges. The wolf's jaws snapped shut on empty air as the bolt dropped into place. Inside, the silence was deafening. Outside, the scratching of claws against the logs sounded like the ticking of 1,000 clocks. Silas Thorne fell onto the dirt floor, his blood pooling in the dust of a home he had built with his own hands. He had survived the physical assault, but the man who entered that cabin was not the same man who had left it. The breaking point had been reached, and in the crucible of the North, he had been reforged into something harder, colder, and infinitely more silent. The silence inside a frontier cabin in the 1880s was never truly silent. It was a symphony of settling timber, the whistle of wind through chinking, and, in Silas Thorne's case, the rhythmic dripping of blood onto seasoned pine floorboards. When the bolt slid into place, the immediate threat of the hunt ended, but the historical aftermath, the cold, clinical reality of surviving a catastrophic injury in the 19th century, had only just begun. Silas lay in the dark, the heat of his body rapidly dissipating into the unheated room, a space that was now a tomb of his own making unless he could summon one final vestige of strength. To understand the gravity of this aftermath, we must look at the medical realities of the late Victorian frontier. In 1884, there were no antibiotics. The germ theory of disease, pioneered by Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur, was only just beginning to filter into the rugged outposts of the north. For a man with a compound fracture and deep puncture wounds from an apex predator, the primary cause of death wasn't usually the initial trauma. It was septicemia, blood poisoning. Silas was well aware of the pioneer's choice. He could either surrender to the fever that would inevitably come, or he could perform a feat of self-surgery that few modern humans can even conceptualize. Historical records from this era show that survival often depended on cauterization and splinting. Using the last of his matches and a small store of dry kindling he had left by the hearth, Silas built a fire. The light flickered against the walls, illuminating the trophies of his life, the pelts, the dried herbs, the tools of a trade that had nearly claimed him. He took his elk-handled skinning knife and placed it into the coals until the steel glowed a dull, translucent cherry red. The aftermath was not a period of rest. It was a period of calculated agony. He pressed the white-hot steel into the wolf bites on his shoulder and the open wound on his thigh. The smell of searing flesh filled the cabin, a scent that Silas would carry in his nostrils for the rest of his life. Outside, the pack remained. This is a documented behavior of boreal timber wolves during periods of extreme prey scarcity. They do not simply leave when a door is closed. They waited. They paced the perimeter of the cabin, their claws clicking against the foundation stones like the beads of a rosary. They could smell the wood smoke, but more importantly, they could smell the scent of decay as Silas's body began its inflammatory response. To the wolves, the cabin was not a fortress. It was a slow cooker. They were willing to wait out the winter storm, knowing that a man who cannot walk cannot hunt, and a man who cannot hunt eventually becomes a feast. The psychological aftermath of such an encounter is what historians call the predator's shadow. Long after the physical wounds healed into jagged silver scars, the mind remains in that ravine. Silas spent the next 6 days in a delirious haze, drifting between the reality of his freezing cabin and a fever dream world where he was a wolf and the wolves were men. He survived by drinking melted snow and chewing on raw strips of dried venison he could reach from his bunk. In the broader, grand tapestry of history, Silas Thorne's struggle was a microcosm of the westward expansion. Every mile of the frontier was bought with this kind of localized, unrecorded suffering. The aftermath was the realization that nature is not an enemy to be defeated, but a neighbor that must be respected and occasionally paid in blood. When the storm finally broke on the 7th day and the pack drifted back into the shadows of the Great Range, they left behind a man who had been stripped of his illusions. He had looked into the yellow eyes of the void and realized that his place in the world was not at the top of a hierarchy, but as a temporary guest in a house owned by the wind and the wolf. The story of Silas Thorne does not end with a rescue, for in the 1880s, the cavalry was a myth of the dime novels. His survival was a quiet, agonizing reconstruction. It took 3 months before he could put weight on his leg, using a crutch he fashioned from a stunted birch limb. When he finally stepped out of his cabin into the pale, weak sun of March, the snow was receding, revealing the historical debris of his struggle. The discarded traps, the charred remains of his fire, and the bleached bones of the yearling wolf he had struck with his rifle. To look upon these remnants is to view a tributary of the human spirit. Silas's legacy is not found in history books, for the frontier was swallowed by the industrial gears of the 20th century shortly after his time. Instead, his legacy exists in the very concept of resilience, the stubborn refusal of the biological heart to stop beating when the mind has every reason to surrender. This is the primal contract we all carry, the silent agreement that we will fight for one more breath, even when the yellow eyes of our own metaphorical wolves are closing in. The historical aftermath of the North American wilderness teaches us that we are not separate from nature. We are a part of its brutal, beautiful cycle. Silas Thorne lived another 20 years, but he never again hunted the timber wolf. Historical accounts suggest that men who survived such close-quarter encounters often developed a strange, silent kinship with their predators. They realized that the wolf was not evil. It was simply hungry. It was a mirror reflecting the same desperate survival instinct that Silas used to strike his matches in the dark. In the modern world, we have paved over the ravines and lit the darkness with LED bulbs, but the yellow eyes have not disappeared. They have merely changed shape. They are the shadows of our own fears, the isolation of our digital ages, and the fragility of our comforts. To study the life of a 19th century trapper is to engage in a documentary of the soul. It reminds us that beneath our layers of technology and civilization, there is a core of ancient granite that can withstand the coldest winter. Silas Thorne's cabin eventually collapsed into the earth, reclaimed by the spruce and the moss. The ledger he carried was lost to a fire in a trading post years later, but the vibration of his will remains. It is a frequency that resonates every time a human being faces an impossible threshold and chooses to crawl forward rather than lie down in the snow. We preserve these stories not just to educate, but to remind ourselves of what we are capable of when the archive of life is stripped down to its final burning page. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.